So thank you all for being here today. As she said, I'm going to be talking about women, warfare, and the law with the case study. So I wanted to start. So, what is a female combatant? Female combatant is a female military personnel who is assigned to a combat position, hence the name combatant. Women have not always been officially allowed to fulfill combat roles, although that has definitely not stopped women from participating in conflicts for hundreds of years, and then in more modern times, especially since World War One. Women have, and some continue to be regulated to positions outside of direct combat roles. These include like medical positions, such as nurses, also administrative roles, intelligence, clerical. These have historically been viewed as the traditional roles for women, whereas men traditionally they are viewed as being able to serve in like combat positions. So now let's look at a few significant women who've been a part of warfare. So Jinga Bande was a warrior queen who ruled the kingdoms Dongo and Matamba, which is the area now considered modern-day Angola. In 1626, she became queen of Dongo following the death of her brother. And her brother and her both dealt with a lot of attacks from the Portuguese, and they had been doing this for years. And once there was a little bit of instability with her brother dying and her becoming queen, the Portuguese renewed their attacks. So she was forced to retreat from her lands in Dongo, and so she fled and installed herself as the ruler of Matamba, where then she launched a prolonged campaign of guerrilla warfare against the Portuguese for several decades to follow. She's really remembered for assembling a diverse army to oppose the Portuguese. This included runaway slaves, defecting soldiers, and also a lot of women. She developed the reputation of being a legendary warrior as she personally led her troops into battle until she was well into her 60s. So I wanted to start off with her because I think she really shows really great leadership as a queen and as a female combatant, personally leading her troops into battle. Next, we're going to talk about Mai Bago. She was a Sikh woman who fought against the Mughal Empire in the early 18th century. She was a young woman during the height of the Sikh oppression, and in 1705, she was outraged to learn that 40 men from her village had deserted their Sikh leader, who was under attack and being sieged. She rallied the men and encouraged them to find their leader, protect him, and then she led them into a very dangerous battle where they killed many of the enemy soldiers, and a lot of their own people was killed as well. And then after the battle, she impressed the leader so much that she became his personal bodyguard and served him for the remaining majority of her life. And she has been considered a saint warrior in the Sikh nation for over 300 years. And then the last female fighter we're going to talk about today is Malunka Savic. She was a female Serbian soldier who fought in the Balkan Wars and in World War One. She joined the Serbian army in 1912 disguised as a man, and she saw combat within weeks. During war, she was actually wounded by a grenade, and while being treated in the hospital, it was revealed that she was a woman. Her commanding officer didn't want to punish her, but instead he offered her a transfer to a nursing division. As we said, a lot of women were regulated to like medical positions, such as being a nurse, but she refused. And so her officer eventually relented and allowed her to stay and fight as an infantry soldier. She continued to serve for many years, and she was wounded no less than 9 times during her service. And throughout her time, she received many decorations and medals as a soldier and is considered the most decorated female combatant in the history of warfare. So these were just 3 female combatants and warriors that I wanted to touch on, but there have been several others who have fought and led battles, who have really turned the tides of many conflicts. But moving on, we're going to look at women in warfare more so today and in modern times. So, is it more normalized today for women to serve in the military? As we previously discussed, in an official capacity, women have traditionally held like administrative and nursing roles because those roles were viewed okay for women. Yet in recent decades, direct combat roles have been opened up to women where they are able to serve in other roles that are more direct in combat. To show the increased normalization of this, there are several countries that have established policies of conscription for women. Just a few of these. One includes North Korea, who actually has the longest mandatory service for women, and it usually ranges from 5 to 7 years based on education and position within society. But women do serve for long periods of time in their military. Norway and Sweden both have the same conscription requirements for men and women. So, in theory, they're kind of on an equal playing field there to serve in the military. Israel has a conscription policy for women where they usually serve around 2 years. There are some exceptions for religious purposes and things like that, but a lot of women are conscripted to the military. Denmark is the latest country to establish conscription for women, and this policy sort of kicks into place when they do not have enough volunteers for their own military. And then also several countries throughout Africa have these policies, such as Eritrea, Chad, Mali, Mozambique, Niger, among many others. So we can see, based on this analyzation of conscription policies, that women in the military has become a much more normalized idea in reality. And national policy sort of reflects this in several countries where it's very normal that men will serve alongside women. And so I think that's really interesting to see. Okay, and then looking at some of like the current estimates, it's estimated that 15% of military forces worldwide are held by women. And this is both direct and non-direct combat roles. But that's a pretty good percentage and a pretty good improvement from women not being able to serve in direct combat roles. The US has a little bit higher of a rate, around 18% of the total force is women serving in all different branches of the military. And then I wanted to look at, what countries had higher rates and what countries had lower rates. The US is up there on being on the higher end, including Hungary as well. And then countries with lower rates include Turkey and India, although they have in recent years encouraged more women into the military. So their rates are rising. And the rates are going to continue to rise as countries pass policies allowing women into combat roles and conscription policies that sort of force women to serve. So while these rates of women in the military are increasing, these women do unfortunately face unparalleled risks of sexual violence and exploitation. This comes from their fellow soldiers, their authority figures, their enemy combatants. A really startling statistic is that 70% of female combatants experience sexual assault or coercion from their fellow soldiers or enemy forces. If this isn't, bad enough, these female combatants also face several barriers to reporting sexual assault within the military. Their claims are often brushed off or not taken seriously, and they can also be discouraged from reporting because they might face retaliation from their unit or their commanding officers. They might not be able to, move up into other positions or roles, especially like leadership roles. And it overall just creates an environment of fear and an environment that discourages female combatants from reporting. In the US, women are more likely to be sexually assaulted by a fellow soldier than die in combat. And this statistic could be simply because women do not serve in combat roles at the rate that men do, but it's still really alarming that their fellow soldiers who, they're supposed to train with and fight with and have each other's backs are going to be more likely to sexually assault them than they are to die in combat. And then women also face the vulnerability of gender discrimination. There is a heavy emphasis placed on physical strength, and promotion within the ranks of the military is usually based on combat opportunities and sort of like proving yourself in the field, which if women are excluded from these roles, combat roles, and they traditionally have been, then it definitely is going to keep women in subordinate positions, and it's going to really not allow them to move up or to rank up. So there are a lot of vulnerabilities that women face in this sort of male-dominated field. So now let's look at how gender and IHL sort of interact. When analyzing international humanitarian law, so IHL, and gender, it is important to recognize that the rules of IHL, they protect women in the same way that it protects men. In theory, there is no discrimination, whether the person is a combatant, a civilian, a prisoner of war. This means that all rules set forth in IHL are supposed to equally protect men and women with no discrimination. Although there is some recognition within IHL that men and women have different needs. IHL recognizes that there are specific needs and vulnerabilities that women face. So I wanted to include these two rules that are sort of additional protections for women. Customary IHL Rule 134 reads that the specific protections, health, and assistance needs for women affected by armed conflict must be respected. This applies to all women, whether they find themselves at home, fighting as a combatant, being held as a POW, or whether they're displaced because of the conflict. This rule is important because it acknowledges that women are affected by conflict differently, and they need different assistance as opposed to men. I also included customary IHL Rule 93 that prohibits the use of rape and sexual violence during armed conflict. This rule, again, applies to everyone, men, women, and children. Everyone can be the victim or the survivor of sexual violence, but women are overwhelmingly the targets of rape and sexual violence, especially during the chaos and sort of the fog of war. This is true even for female combatants. As we just previously discussed, they face the vulnerabilities within their own military and from enemy forces, those vulnerabilities of sexual violence and rape. So this IHL rule is important because it does acknowledge the fact that rape and sexual violence are used, and they sort of are rampantly used a lot in armed conflict. And so it prohibits that from happening. Or, I mean, it still happens, but it prohibits, there's a rule against it. And then some other protections. The Third Geneva Convention is important because it provides special protections for all prisoners of war, but also ones that are women. These protections include, to start with, the general principle of equal protection, which requires that all POWs be treated alike. And so this doesn't mean that men and women get the exact same treatment. It means that for treatment to be equal, men and women are going to have different needs. And so they must receive different treatment to ensure that both sides are protected in equal measure. There are also general provisions that have gendered applications. So Article 26 of the Third Geneva Convention requires that the detaining power must provide food that will keep POWs in good health. To achieve this, food and nutrition requirements must be adapted to the individual circumstances. So, for example, pregnant women who are POWs are most definitely going to have different nutrition standards than men or women who are not pregnant in those situations. So the detaining power must take that into account and provide the adequate nutrition for those POWs. Also, there are specific provisions on gender-specific risks. Article 14 requires that parties to a conflict consider the distinct needs and risks of women POWs, especially in relation to privacy, safety, and medical care. Women POWs are required separate sleeping quarters, separate hygiene facilities, and if they receive punishments, it is supposed to be no more severe than a member of the armed forces of the detaining powers would receive. So this last part is important because in theory, it protects women in cases where they might face harsher punishments for transgressing gender norms that work against women in combat roles. So this is sort of another one of those vulnerabilities where in a lot of countries, women might be allowed to fulfill combat roles, but because of stereotypes or gender norms, especially within the family, or just structurally ideas that women are supposed to be the head of the household, not be on the front lines of combat, this rule protects them from being punished as POWs for what the detaining power might see as transgressing gender norms. So that is very important. Also, if the detaining power cannot accommodate pregnant POWs, then they must be repatriated so that they can receive the care that they need, whether that be nutrition requirements, adequate medical care, which of course pregnant POWs are going to need. If they cannot receive this, then they must be sent back to their country. So these are all very important protections for women POWs, and this is significant because female combatants fighting in armed conflict have these protections set up in place if they are captured or detained. So looking at gender in armed conflict in general, the ICRC explains that gender definitely shapes a person's experience in armed conflicts in very complex ways. Structural inequalities pre-exist armed conflict, and so gender roles and social power dynamics, they can shift during armed conflict or they can be made worse. So, and also while gender is affected by armed conflict, gender also intersects with other identity factors such as race, ethnicity, class, religion, age, etc. So when all of these intersectionalities come about, it can really affect like a person's experience of armed conflict. So for example, traditional gender roles place men as the head of households, with women being really limited in their independence. So when men are called to fight in conflict, since it is generally like a male-dominated profession and they're the ones fighting, if they are injured or they die, it leaves the women to care for their household with no way to financially support themselves or their family. Also, if women are not expected to work in sort of a public setting or they have no experience doing that, it can be really difficult for them to get jobs and to find that financial support that they need. Female combatants also face structural inequalities within the military, so this places them sort of at a disadvantage during armed conflict. And as we've talked about, some of these stereotypes and gender roles placed on women might include the ideas that women are emotional and physically weak, while in comparison, men are the rational thinkers and they're physically strong. These ideas may be on an individual level, but then they end up permeating structurally and really creates that culture of women being weak or that they don't belong in the military, and it can really put women at a disadvantage. This especially affects them if they want to move up into leadership roles. They might be viewed as incompetent or not strong enough to lead men, and female combatants might face that sort of pushback if they are leading a like male unit or it's overwhelmingly men that they are leading. And then an interesting question that I wanted to explore in this webinar is whether women commit war crimes, and if they do, if it if it is at a rate comparable to men. So, women's experience of war is often thought to be strictly through victimization. They are considered victims, never usually active participants. And because of these stereotypes, they are usually not suspected as being perpetrators or being able to commit crimes, and therefore they are not investigated or charged. Yet women have, and they do commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. Women have committed crime, particularly, international humanitarian crime throughout history. During Hitler's genocide in Germany, thousands of women actively participated in some of the worst war crimes. Many women oversaw concentration camps, but also ordinary civilians, whether they were married to officers, whether they had family that were actively in the regime, or maybe they just wanted to be a part of it. There were several like ordinary civilians who just participated in sort of upholding and supporting the murder machinery of the Holocaust. And at the end of World War II, dozens of women were brought before tribunals held by like the Allies' power at the end of World War II. Women were also active participants and leaders of war crimes throughout the Rwandan genocide and also wars in the former Yugoslavia. They have been, there has been proof that they held leadership roles and they were responsible for some of the most heinous war crimes. And so 5 women have been indicted before international courts and tribunals, which really, and this is in comparison to hundreds of men who have been brought before courts. And this shows that women being charged and brought before court is more so a rare exception than a norm. And so this does not necessarily mean that they commit war crimes at any less of a rate than men do. It simply means that because of stereotypes of them simply being victims, women are not always considered perpetrators, and a lot of times they get away with these crimes. So we have discussed gender, we've discussed IHO and female combatants throughout history, but now I wanted to do a case study of the Kurdish YPJ. So looking at who are they? So YPJ stands for Yekanian Palestinajin, which is Kurdish for women's defense units / kind of like protection units. And this group is an all-female fighting group that is a part of the Syrian Democratic Forces, and they are very closely affiliated with the male group, the YPG, which is like the People's Protection Units. The YPG, which is sort of like the umbrella, like overall group, began as a group for men and women. So it was established at the beginning of the Syrian Civil War in 2011, and it was formed to protect Kurdish minority groups and like from rebel armed groups and also the Assad regime fighting against each other. And the country was really just plunged into like chaotic conflict. So the YPG was formed and men and women joined, hundreds of them. But then in April 2013, the YPJ, they advocated for separating into their own group. And so they established themselves as the YPJ. And they still work very closely with the YPG, but they're still sort of distinct groups. The YPJ is politically aligned with the Democratic Union Party in Syria. Their ideology is based on the teachings of Abdullah Öcalan. He really advocates for like the liberation of women and teaches that for Kurdish liberation to be achieved, women have to be a very vital part of that. Women's participation in nation building, in independence, in leadership is really central to the teachings from him. And they're very central to the teachings within the YPJ. And that when they do training, they do military training, but also sort of learning and reading books and understanding their own liberation as women in like gender roles and stereotypes. So the YPJ under the YPG, when they first started with a few hundred women, but their numbers quickly grew and, they separated. And so between 2014 and 2016, the YPJ consisted of around 7,000 to 20,000 members. And as of August 2017, the group reportedly had around 24,000 members, which this was right around their peak of their fight against ISIS. So they had a lot more people joining, a lot more women joining, wanting to defend, everyone. So then today, they're still a part of the Syrian Democratic Forces, and that force is about 115,000. And so of that number, 15,000 of those are women fighting for the YPJ. And this includes women not just who are Kurdish, but also Arab women, women in that region, Iraqi women. They all come together and fight together. So it's not just Kurdish women. So I wanted to talk a bit about their success. They were very instrumental throughout the Syrian civil war, just for protecting people in general, but also fighting against the group of ISIS. So they were a leading fighting force in many battles that turned the fight against that extremist group. They were really one of the prominent on the ground fighting force. So the US ended up coming in and supporting them with airstrikes and things like that. But they were really the ones on the ground fighting. So the attack on Kobani is just one prime example. You can see on the top along the border with Turkey where the blue arrow is pointing, that is where the town of Kobani is. And so in September of 2014, ISIS attacked that town. And so the area was very important because, of course, you can see it's along the border with Turkey. And so ISIS could funnel in a lot of supplies, a lot of foreign fighters, and then, disperse them throughout Syria wherever they needed them. So ISIS really wanted to take over this town. And so they sieged the town, and the siege lasted for several months. And in January, remember it started in September, so all the way up until January, the YPJ, along with the male counterpart YPG, in addition to the US air support of airstrikes and sometimes supply drops, they finally pushed ISIS out of the city, effectively really dealing a blow to the rampage that ISIS had sort of been on across Syria. And this was sort of their first really big success, I guess, on like a world stage with the US backing them. It sort of brought a sort of kind of a spotlight on them and their success there. And so then they were also crucial to the liberation of Raqqa in 2017. ISIS had taken over the city. They had really brutally harmed and oppressed everyone that lived there, everyone that did not have the time or the materials and money to evacuate. And so in 2017, the YPJ helped lead the ground forces in their liberation of the city. And they were very successful and pushed ISIS out of there and really weakened them to a very good point of weakening. So the YPJ's women's leadership was very crucial, and it really showed on a world stage that women were a part of the fight and they were successful in the fight. The fighting units also played a crucial role in weakening ISIS to the point that they no longer had very strong strongholds in Syria. So the YPJ was very successful in their fight against ISIS. They weakened them to a point that they were able to sort of shift their focus. And so the Syrian forces had a bit of time to sort of relax after, the fight against ISIS, but almost immediately they started again fighting Turkey and Turkey-backed militias, mainly the Syrian National Army. And these forces had launched several military operations in SDF-controlled territories, so mainly like northern Syria. So the whole reason for this was Turkey considers the SDF an extension of the Kurdistan Workers' Party. So this party in Turkey has fought for Kurdish rights there, and they have been listed as a terrorist organization by Turkey. So, of course, Turkey does not want these groups that they feel that they feel are linked to the Workers' Party in their country. They don't want them right along their border. So then they started doing sort of incursions and little battles and things, trying to push them back from their border. So that has been mainly what the YPJ has been focused on. They have also been dealing with the uncertainty that has come with the change in leadership since the fall of the Assad regime in December 2024. A commander with the YPJ stated in an interview earlier this year with the Irish Times that there are a lot of concerns with the new leadership. In January, a victory conference was held. 18 armed factions came together. They agreed to dissolve into a new Syrian army under the leadership of the interim president. Yet the commander states there were no women present. There were only men. And based on comments from other officials in the government, they have said that, women should go back to the homes, they should have children, they should know their place as like educators within the family. And this has created, of course, a lot of concern for the YPJ as they have really asserted themselves as independent, as a very important fighting force and leading force in general. And so they do have those fears that they're going to at least be fought against and might lose their autonomy or independence as women and as a fighting force. So that has been sort of their current focus after they weakened ISIS to a point that they could shift their focus to that.
Thank you so much, Maddie. That was so interesting.
Thank you.
Um, Great. So we have some extra time, and I would love to have you all ask Maddie some questions. So please go into the Q&A box and drop any questions you have for Maddie about the YPJ or women in warfare and special protections under IHL. And while some of those come in, I have a question, Maddie. Can you tell us what you found the most interesting about putting your presentation together?
Yeah, so I found two things really interesting. I loved the case study, which of course that's, why I chose to do it. But I loved learning about the Kurdish YPJ and like just how successful and prominent they have been as a female fighting force. But also I found it interesting reading about women as war criminals and how they've sort of been like underestimated, I guess, as being able to be that violent, I guess. I mean, I don't support war crimes, but it was very interesting to put together and learn about.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Here's a question. Where does the YPJ funding and training come from? Is it through the Syrian government?
So, not through the Syrian government, from my understanding, it's more so from like them being under the Syrian Democratic Forces. That force in general has been supported by like various countries. Like I know the US during their time fighting ISIS, they supplied them with a lot of like military weapons and more so like supplies. But I know it's not really from like the Syrian government. I think it's more so from like outside forces and also like just Kurdish like groups within Syria. So like when they were fighting and stuff, they would be given food and like sometimes a place to stay by like the people in the cities they were trying to liberate or keep ISIS out of. I don't know if that answers it too well, but
Can you tell us a little bit about, I know you said it was interesting reading about female fighters and the war crimes that they committed. Can you talk about how some of those tribunals, like the Rwanda Genocide Tribunal, are unique because they are starting a new precedent?
yeah, so they are really unique in the fact that they do it wasn't many, but it was some women that they actually, had proof and they brought them before court and actually charged them. And so it was really interesting to see, like maybe one or two for each tribunal. And it was mainly women who had been in leadership roles. And so yeah, they really targeted women that had been in leadership roles, but then that also does set the precedent of women can be war criminals and commit war crimes, and that, we shouldn't just overlook them. That's a whole nother layer of understanding armed conflict and violence better. So, yeah.
Great. So I know the YPJ are kind of unique in being a only female fighting force. Do you know if they've inspired any other female fighting groups?
They actually have. There is an a Syrian group, and they're called like the Veterinarian or something like along that line. But there are also a female fighting group that is in the area, that I think they really sort of not really encouraged, but they set the example of that, they could do it even maybe with limited resources and limited support. And so it has really sort of branched off, to inspire like other groups like the Veterinarian. It's like an Assyrian group.
Great, thank you. Um, why did you pick the YPJ? I mean, I know that they're unique, but what really inspired you to study them and what brought you back to them as you went through your research?
Mhm. So I read a few books, just about like their fight, but also like their struggle to get to the point of being able to be so successful. And I really wanted to analyze, them as a female group, but also be able to look at their sort of after their fight with ISIS, now like more of a mainstream, like modern female fighting force that a lot of people might not be readily familiar with, but a lot of people I feel like have heard maybe about the fight with ISIS, and then to know, they played such a vital role in that. And also they have proved, gender classifications are not really important when it comes to how effective a like fighting force can be. Because they had a lot of women soldiers who were even leading like men and really were successful in weakening ISIS to a point. And so I thought it would just be really interesting to look at female combatants and like IHL, but also like a real, real life example of like a fighting force that's made of women.
Great. If anyone wants to learn more about the YPJ or about women in warfare, what are some resources that you would recommend?
So there's a lot of, background information you can sort of learn online. I personally found some books. I looked up, what are some really interesting books. One is The Daughters of Kobani, and that gives sort of like a overview of the YPJ forming as a group, but also talks about them in the attack on Kobani, like the liberation of Raqqa. And so I found it personally more helpful reading, like books and resources on it.
Great. Um, do you think there's possibly groups like this that are present in international wars like Ukraine? Have you
Hmm.
come across any?
Yeah, I think that could definitely be a possibility. I did come across not really a specific group, but I think it was an article on like Ukraine, a lot of women serving in like the Ukrainian army and being a part of the Ukrainian like war that's going on. So I don't think there's any maybe specifically like an armed force, but I do think a lot of them serve in and fight in the war going on there right now.
Yeah. I think an observation I've had, and I'd love to know if you agree with this, is that when there's active warfare going on, we tend to see women have more uh, autonomy and power
Mhm.
in fighting forces because there's a level of sort of desperation and need for additional people to be in the fighting force. And so there are less barriers in place. And that is unfortunately when we tend to see more progress.
For sure. I definitely agree with that. Um, because then they actually can sort of step out of those roles that they've been like regulated to and become leaders and really show that gender doesn't really matter in the terms of like leadership and serving and really being successful.